Good evening, everyone. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's show. Well, before we get started with the discussion, I'd like to thank a few of our amazing sponsors. Tonight's episode has been generously supported by the Leela and Mickey Strauss Family Foundation. Thank you so much. The Shakespeare Hour is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is sponsored by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Finally, it's a bittersweet night for me this evening because this is my last time broadcasting from the Rectortown Methodist Church Hall here in Rectortown, Virginia. I say it every week, but my sincerest thanks to the congregation for letting me use your wonderful space. I could not do the Shakespeare Hour without you and your amazing Ethernet cable. Well, now it's to Richard II. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you all to tonight's panelists. We are joined by Nora Carroll, writer, teacher, and actor who played Queen Isabel opposite Robert Sean Leonard in the Old Globes production of Richard II. Nora, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Nora. Thanks for coming on the show tonight.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Where are you broadcasting from, Nora?
So I am in Chicago, Little Village, Chicago.
Okay, very good. Another city in America that I've heard a lot about, but I've never visited, but really hope to soon. And in Chicago, you have a great Shakespeare theatre,
Yes.
which I think you've worked at.
Yes, we have Chicago Shakespeare Theater. Barbara is the artistic director, and I had the pleasure of doing Comedy of Errors there this past winter, right before, things shifted.
Things changed. Well, let me ask you, if I may, an icebreaker question that I'm going to ask all the panelists this evening, which is, as we're talking about a play that is so concerned with power, what do you think is the attraction of power? Why are we so drawn to it, do you think? What is the lure of power for you?
Yeah, so I might sound a little cliche, but I do think that it is based in fear. Oh. The fear of not having enough, very much a scarcity mentality. I have to have it all in order to feel good about myself. And for those who do reach the top, there's always a fear that someone else is trying to take this power away from you. And for those who have never felt power, who get that glimpse of power, they want to hang on to it. So I think it's rooted in a lot of fear.
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't think that's a cliche at all. That feels the first revelation of this evening, that the lust for power is rooted in fear. So that's terrific. And I look forward to unpacking that, particularly in relation to the play, which I think has some very interesting things to say about fear and power together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let me introduce Naomi Jacobs, STC-affiliated artist, Woolly Mammoth Theatre Company member, and three-time Helen Hayes Award winner. Hello, Naomi.
Hi, Simon. Nice to be here.
And where are you this evening, Naomi?
I'm in my home in Silver Spring, Maryland, just over the district line.
Okay, very good. Not too far away. And how has the lockdown, as it were, the extended period of closure been for you as an actress, as an actor, as a freelance actor? How's that been?
Well, it certainly has changed things. I had about 9 months worth of work that went away, but I'm lucky enough that I'm also a teaching artist. So I've been able to teach and keep up both with classes and with private clients. And I have not eaten this many dinners at home since I was 12.
Okay. Well, that's a great way of describing this period. Thank you. I think we all understand and recognize that. Let me share, if I may, the same question that we've just discussed about the lure of power. We've talked about fear. What for you is the attraction of power? What would you add to that?
Well, I love what Nora said, and I will add to that of course you have power. You don't necessarily have it. It's how people treat you that tells you have power. And so when you have power and people are treating you like you're witty and fascinating and beautiful and interesting and important, that becomes addictive. You suddenly feel like you're so very fascinating. And I can see you holding on to that, but it's also, that is sourced from externally, from the outside in. And so when that all goes away from the outside and you're left on your own, which is what I think we see happen to Richard, there becomes, you realize that power has nothing to do, real power has nothing to do with the external and to do with how you see yourself or how you source from inside.
Well, I think that's a very Shakespearean question, isn't it? The external and the internal self, and how they speak to each other, and how they change and shift, especially in very extreme circumstances. Thank you. Well, one of the pleasures of running the show as long as we have is that we get the opportunity to invite guests back for a kind of encore. And it's an absolute joy this evening to welcome back Dr. Michael Whitmore, Director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington.
Hello.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for coming back and joining us for the second time.
Oh, I'm honored to be back, Simon.
Well, you were an amazing panel member last time, so it's our honor to have you back. Thank you. Well, Michael, let's cut straight to it. Power. Why do we crave it? Why do we want it? Why do we need it?
What a great topic and a great Shakespearean topic. I liked the past two comments that fear and insecurity really make people crave all the lies that people tell you when you have power, all the pretty lies that people often can't resist. I guess I think of two kinds of power. One that maybe is the one people want, which is absolute power. And that's the power of not ever having to say please and of taking every shortcut you want. Most of the people who want that kind of power are the people who never say please and always take shortcuts. I do think there's another kind of power which is related to this play, and I can talk more about it, but that's the power which also makes you accountable to the people that you lead. And that's something that was very much on Shakespeare's mind in this play. And so I guess I'm going to fudge it a little, but I think there are a couple kinds of power. And a lot of people want one, but maybe not so many people want the other.
Yes, that's interesting because it touches on the theme of responsibility, I think, power and responsibility and accountability, which is a very, in a way, it's a daunting word. I think you're right. And I think we see a king under enormous duress in this play as he tries to figure out who is he accountable to, the people or to God or to history. And there are many, these always become characters in their own right. Thank you, Michael. Well, let me now finally introduce my co-host, our resident dramaturg and literary manager, Drew Lichtenberg. Hi, Drew.
Hi, Simon. This conversation is already fascinating. I would just offer maybe that it's more that the obtaining and exercise of power is not a moral thing, and that we are jealous of people who are skilled at manipulating themselves and others in the pursuit of power. So maybe just like let that one simmer before we get into tonight's topic, which is Richard II. It being election season, there's really only one play from Shakespeare that we could discuss, in my personal opinion, which is this play. But I just want to share a few quick housekeeping notes with our viewers watching on Vimeo. Before you can start chatting or asking questions, please enter your name in the dialogue box. And then if you would like to ask a question, click on the blue Ask button. And lastly, as always, keep an eye out for our Friday newsletter where we will attend to all unanswered or outstanding questions, or I will just write on a topic related to the show. So our theme tonight, our play, our focus is Richard II, which is a very unique play in Shakespeare's canon. It's usually dated to 1595 as part of his lyric period, right when the theaters were reopening after being closed due to the plague. Shakespeare had been writing a lot of poetry, a lot of sonnets, supporting himself as a freelance writer, and he needed money, so he turned back to writing for the theater. This is the period of Romeo and Juliet, of A Midsummer Night's Dream, of Love's Labour's Lost, some of his most beautiful and poetic plays. And Richard II, in fact, is written entirely in verse. It's the only Shakespeare play that has no prose whatsoever in it. So it's unique for that reason. It is also a play that is about the exchange of power. It's sort of the historical beginning of the 8-play cycle, that the two tetralogies that would end with the Wars of the Roses and the Henry VI plays and Richard III, of course, which ends with the ascension of Henry Tudor, Henry VII, Elizabeth I's grandfather. So this is Shakespeare writing ancient history in the form of drama that leads up to the present day, that his audience would have had a very palpable relationship with. A quick synopsis of the play. Richard II is the king. He is a slightly corrupt king. He is appropriating money from his nobles. He is staffing his court with a bunch of non-noble people whom he has elevated to a very high position, which is leading a lot of the nobles to feel disgruntled. He is fighting expensive foreign wars in Ireland. In other words, he is causing a great deal of civil discord and dissension. And he eventually comes into conflict with his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, later King Henry IV, and the action charts the decline of Richard II's power and the ascent of Henry Bolingbroke's power. And they sort of meet halfway in the middle of the play in Flint Castle, and then in the famous deposition scene where how power, the kingship is handed over from Richard to Henry. And eventually, spoiler alert, Richard is murdered in the Tower of London at the end of the play. It was a very, very popular play in Shakespeare's lifetime. It was printed in quarto form 6 times, 5 times while Shakespeare was alive. Michael will probably tell us a little bit more about the quartos. It was also performed at a very controversial event in 1601 when the Earl of Essex, Elizabeth I's favorite, tried to stage a coup d'etat and depose her. So Elizabeth, according to the legend, said, "I am Richard II. Know ye not that?" So our guiding question for tonight's discussion is how Shakespeare dramatizes the exchange of power in this play, Richard II, with maybe some ancillary questions that may arise from that, why it was so popular, why it may have been very controversial in his lifetime, and what this controversial play, this popular play that is, I would say, slightly obscure part of the canon now, what it communicates or how it speaks to us today. Whew, a lot to get into. Michael Whitmore, I wonder if we could start with you, how you respond to my introductory spiel and also your thoughts on this question.
Drew, I'm grateful for your introductory spiel because you set it up beautifully. You know, in a way, Shakespeare invented the history play. And if you think about what Lin-Manuel Miranda did with American colonial history, which is more than 200 years prior, when Shakespeare's writing in the 1580s and 90s, the events that he's depicting are also, you know, 2 centuries old. And so it's interesting that for some reason, having a time lag makes it popular to actually then go present what are monarchical histories on stage, and in our case, the early history of the Republic. So that's the first thing. I think Shakespeare realized you could tell stories about all this. And so then he read the histories that were available to him, and he used them liberally. So some of the things he depicts are fact, and other things are theatrical necessity. You pointed out another really important thing, which is that these plays chart an arc between an initial dispossession of power, which happens in this play, and that's the forcible deposition of an anointed king. That is a huge deal. And in the plays that follow it, in the historical sequence, we learn that great ruin and bloodshed follow. So in a way, these plays, what's set up here is a rupture in the political world where a sitting king is forced to give up his crown, which I think for many was just metaphysically impossible. And I'll say a little bit about why, to a point where order is restored with Elizabeth and the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII. So second thing to say is that this is the beginning of a story that flatters the people who see it at the time it is written. All of that bloodshed, the War of the Roses, may have come about because of this pivotal moment. And so for that reason, as we think about power, you know, one of the things Shakespeare seems to say over and over again is, it's hard to get power, but it's really hard to give it away. And if you look at a play like King Lear, that's a story about just how hard it is to hand someone power. And in the deposition scene in this play, the king actually hands over the crown. And so in a democracy, we have those kinds of hands over of power. There's a mechanism for getting that to work. It's in the United States, it's a constitution. And so someone leaves and then someone else arrives because of the consent of people who voted. And that's what makes that person legitimate. But the last thing I wanted to point out about this play is that in the Middle Ages, what made a king legitimate was that the king, there were two things. First, the king is God's representative on earth. So the status of that king is divinely sanctioned. And that's why when a king dies, they say, let's say, the king is dead, God save the king. Because at least in theory, there really was only one eternal king, and it was in the keeping of God's hands. And it was somehow metaphysically translated from one person to the next. It was almost a theological event. So that's just very different from our society. The second, also different from our society, was in the Middle Ages, kingship also meant working alongside your peers who are nobles or barons. And medieval society meant that the king actually has to listen to those peers and barons. He's the ultimate authority, but in practice, it was a sharing relationship. And in this play, Richard shows signs of being an absolute monarch. He also shows signs of being, and this is a big no-no, a transactional monarch. I think of some of our challenges politically today is thinking about the ways in which we're a country of laws. Are we also a country of deals? I mean, how is it that you exercise power appropriately and legitimately? But in the Middle Ages, people with power and property actually had an obligation to the people who lived on those lands. And that was seen as a symmetrical, I'm going to use some long words, symmetrical, reciprocal relationship. The king and the lord of the manor owed something to the people who lived on those lands, including shelter protection. Very different from our society where those relationships are contractual. You owe people things because you signed a piece of paper. But again, that was seen as a very important spiritual thing. And in this play, Richard II is accused of being a transactional leader. And we can talk more about why that would have been wrong. But I've always find it useful to say just how different it was in the past, because then sometimes it jogs loose things that help us see the present in a different way.
Yeah, indeed. I think, Michael, to speak to your point, the beginning of really his problem with Bolingbroke, well, it's complicated in the play, but there is a lot of quasi-legal language devoted to Richard appropriating the property and lands of Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt. And,
yes.
And this is not something that would have been done. As the king, you are not just allowed to take something that you want. You cannot strike deals and cut deals. Nora, you played Queen Isabel, who is kind of an intimate of Richard's and also a bit of an outsider in the court, right? She is a French queen. She is somebody who is both simultaneously inside and outside and able to watch this process of his dispossession of power. How do you respond to this question, this dialogue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go back just a little bit, just to respond to Michael, because I find what you're saying about like what's metaphysically possible and not possible, back in 1595. But one of the things that I found very interesting when I was just doing my research for Isabel was that during that time, there was this shift in perspective around whether the Earth was like the center of the universe versus the sun being the center of the universe. And there was that, there's this time where the ideas around what the universe even is, what the sun even is totally shifting. And I think that in a way, Shakespeare is also dramatizing that because we are viewing Richard II as the sun. And, we see this, well, he literally has to go to the ground and he is on the earth. He's brought back down to the ground. And when we are introduced to Richard, we find out these ways in which, like other people have stated, he's not really a great leader. And we don't have very much sympathy for him in the beginning. And I do think that Isabel as a character brings us sympathy for Richard, because we see that this is a woman who is very far away from her home. there is so much talk about England and, this isle and, this language that has so much to do with land. And Isabel this is not her homeland. And I think that the insertion of her as a character really does provide us some sympathy for Richard in the play. Yeah, did I answer the question?
I love your cosmological reading. I think that's right on, right. That is exactly the kind of cosmic disruption that this dispossession is.
Yeah, and it is very far away from our contemporary understanding of the change of state. This is something that normally happens all the time, whereas in Shakespeare's time, this was a crisis, an absolute crisis at the center of. We want to get to Naomi, but Simon, you have your.
Well, yes, Naomi. I just want to say how interesting the metaphysics are in that moment of going. We'll talk more about the past and the present and how they are different and how there are echoes. But I just wanted to say that sometimes when we encounter celebrity or people like the Queen or the Prime Minister, there's almost still a memory in our bodies of something cosmological or something metaphysical or something kind of grand. And it's funny how, although we've come so far from that, there's still a quiver, the archaic, the primal shudder of myth, even as Thomas Mann calls it, which operates within us. And I don't know whether it's good or bad, that feeling, but there's some messages that I recognize. But Naomi, over to you.
Yeah, even on a linguistic level, Simon, we call people stars in the firmament, which I think David Garrick was the first star, and he was called a star for playing Shakespearean roles. Naomi, I want to include you in this conversation, of course. How do you respond to Richard II?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think I looked at this question about how the change of power happens in the play very, very literally. I was looking at it in the opening, Richard is the all-powerful king with divine right. Now, I don't quite grasp divine right. To me, it seems like we all got to agree to it in order for it to happen. But he does say, I love this phrase, not all the water in the rough, rude sea can wash the balm off an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. That's like right in the beginning. And then scene by scene, Shakespeare shows us an unraveling of that assumption. It starts off right away. We see the nobles bowing to him and bending their knee. And then in the second scene, Gaunt, we get the inkling that Gaunt says, well, I think he murdered Gloucester. And suddenly we have an inkling that maybe there's a shadow side. Maybe there's something he's shadier than he should be. And then in scene 4, he introduces, I love Shakespeare, he introduces the idea of a different kind of leader. That as Bolingbroke is leaving, he's been banished. And he says, he has Richard say to Almerle, ourself and Bushy observed his courtship to the common people, how he did seem to dive into their hearts with humble and familiar courtesy. As were our England in reversion his, and he our subjects' next degree in hope. And there it is. Richard is just laid out what we're going to see happen in the play from Richard's mouth. He already has this fear that Nora was talking about, this insecurity that maybe there's a different kind of leader that maybe bloodlines don't support. And then Gaunt, from his dying bed, calls Richard out. I mean, it's the most powerless place you could be, dying in bed, but he's got the guts to call Richard out. And also later, York, a trusted counselor, talks about the legacy of things he's done wrong. And he says to him, if you seize Gaunt's property, which Michael was talking about, if you seize Bolingbroke's inheritance, you pluck 1,000 dangers on your head. You lose 1,000 well-disposed hearts and prick my tender patience to those thoughts which hand an allegiance cannot think. In other words, York, one of the most stable supporters of Richard, is already thinking, if you do this, this metaphysical agreement that we have is going to shift. The world's going to shift. And Shakespeare does all kinds of wonderful things. He has everybody kneeling to him, and then Richard appears on a wall, and a lot is made about the fact that Bolingbroke won't kneel to him. There's a quote about that. And then he has to come down off the wall to the base ground. And then we hear about him coming from London, dust being thrown on his head while Bolingbroke rides his horse, I guess. And then Shakespeare makes a mockery of this whole convention with the scene I was in with the Yorks, where we're all on our knees, like, right, begging Bolingbroke, the new leader. And what I love about that scene is that it happens while the conspirators are plotting already against Bolingbroke's power. And there we all, the three of us, the Yorks, on their knees, you know, begging for him. So in terms of the change of power, I actually looked at it literally, like, what do we see actually happen in the play? And I just want to say that about reflecting on today, there is this agreement, right, in their time that this is the divine leader. And if we're going to accept that that leader deserves our loyalty, then they have to live up to their part of the fiction, right? They've got to care about the people as a whole. They've got to rise above their own interests, rise above special interests. And the alternative to that we see in the play is civil war, right? Well, guess what we're looking at today? In our society, it's about loyalty, isn't it? And as we're confronting a peaceful transition of power right now in this election, the alternative we're realizing might be civil war. Because if loyalty insists that we have to normalize bizarre statements and justify absurd behavior, and we're being given coded and not so coded messages that violence is acceptable, if the leader's power is challenged, then it's going to come down to numbers and weapons. And we are looking at a very real possibility of civil war in our time, and we're not so far away from them. That's all.
Well, it is true, Naomi, that we do place, I think, an almost metaphysical faith in our institutions of democracy. And that when those institutional norms start to be ignored or changed or shaped in a way that is contrary to the way it has been, even though they kind of evolve over time, it does feel like our faith is deeply shaken.
And so many people I know right now, you can feel the anxiety level. You can feel what's happening. And then I just imagine what was happening to the people in Richard's time. That same thing I'm feeling right now, because humans don't change, were the very things that those nobles and people, those were dealing with those same emotions.
But I also love this idea, Naomi, you brought up at the beginning of your response, where you talked about how Shakespeare is dramatizing essentially a new kind of political leader who is more a leader of the people, more of a kind of proto-democratic or a populist politician than somebody who just inherits their status by dint of birth. And I think, we have a question from our viewer, Anne, who's asking actually for a gloss from you, Michael, of the word transactional that you used in your response. But I think maybe this is connected to that in some ways, that Richard is changing the norms of behavior by trying to conduct kind of business deals as a politician. Is that right, Michael? And you're muted, Michael. You have to unmute yourself.
So sorry. So this is a really profound conversation. I think there's a contrast in the play between a more mystical version of legitimate royal power, which is legitimate because it's sanctioned by God and people believe in it, and a more proto-Machiavellian version of power, which is I serve the people who will benefit me. And, in one of these scenes, Gaunt accuses Richard of selling out the royal lands and leasing them, which is for him just incredible. He literally is objecting to the fact that this man is engaging in contracts around what should be a relationship of obligation. And so I think that's where my version of the word comes from. But I also think the play is pretty florid and eloquent about the power of legitimate kingship, that image of water trying to wash off oil. What a beautiful poetic image, because if you've ever tried it, water can't do it. And I'm so challenged by your remarks, Naomi, because and I'd love, to hear a Brit reflect on this, but I think in American democracy, there is almost a kind of secular version of sacred kingship that is conferred by the rituals of democracy, and that includes a whole lot of pageantry. But it's one reading of that is that leaders in America are legitimate because we believe they are. And the challenge of moments like the ones we're in now, where maybe that's the only reason they're legitimate, because we believe they are. And so we're feeling pressure there in a world that seems to us to be a set of, I would say, secular procedures for creating democratic consent. But there's still these residues of almost cosmic legitimacy. Even the pageantry of the American presidency, someone coming through in 3 helicopters and not 1, and the display of arms and the football, these of course are functional things, but they're also part of the mystery. And I think Americans have looked to that as a way to feel comfortable with power.
Yeah, Simon, do you have a response? And you are also now muted, Simon.
Well, thank you. Well, before I want to come back to Nora in a second, if I may, because I think Nora was opening this question of sympathy and sympathy for the devil, to use that title for that rock. Like, is Richard worthy of sympathy? It was a question, I suppose, when Nora was speaking about the Queen's relationship to him. What it made me think of is, actually, if I may be so bold as to blow my own, I hope, muted trumpet, or at least recall my own production of Richard II, which I directed at the Globe in London. And as we were talking, I was thinking about, oh yes, this question of divine right of kings, and how do we ever identify or even understand a character who believes they are ordained by God to be the king forever? And I think I'm right in thinking that Richard II was crowned king when he was very young, when he was a boy. And so what we decided to do in the production was we opened it. It was a period production. It was in period costumes of staging the coronation of Richard. So we cast a young boy to walk through with huge fanfares and paraphernalia and to be crowned. And I think what it was trying to do was to give the audience an insight into the depths of identification that this character feels with the role of king. It's not a job, it's not a role, it's themselves. It is them. Mm. And I think what perhaps Shakespeare's interested in is the tension between that which we identify ourselves as being and that which we are. It's back, I guess, to external, internal selves. But let me hand over to Nora about your relationship, Nora, in terms of sympathy towards Richard and yes, whether he's worthy of our sympathy, Nora.
Yes. So I think that anytime for me, I always want to be able to sympathize with the character in the play. And I do think I sympathize with the character in the play. How that relates to real life, though, I think that you can have sympathy for who a person is, but they don't necessarily have to be absolved of the things that they've done, of the crimes that they've committed, or of, as it was said before, of this transactional behavior. I think you can have that sympathy, but but then still know that there are still consequences that need to be enforced. Do I think he should have died? No. But yeah, I think that it's possible for both of these things to exist, for the consequences to still be very real and necessary, as well as sympathy. And I think that's why a lot of us go to the theater, is because we do want to tap into empathy. We don't want to just say he's the bad guy and just root for his demise the entire time. And I think Shakespeare knew that. He knew that we needed to see something in a piece of ourselves in Richard, as extravagant as he is, as far as star-like as he was. We still need to be able to see like a piece of ourselves in this character.
And I think, Nora, what you're saying is Shakespeare at his most complicated, where he will give us two simultaneous and opposing truths and not tip his hand either way, and leave it up to us to synthesize them as audience members.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because I still think that the prison scene is very heartbreaking. I think the scene between Isabel and Richard, it's very heartbreaking. And yeah, it's way more complicated than Shakespeare being like, this is how you should not lead, you know?
Yeah, he does strangely grow and grow and grow in tragic stature and in our sympathy over the course of the play until at the end, it's like, how can you kill this king? How can you actually do this thing? Well, we have a lot of questions from our viewers, and I know I want to get to some more passages from the play, because the language of this play is just to die for. But Simon, I wonder, our virtual gala is coming up this Saturday. I wonder if you would like to give us an update on our guests, and it is a big guest list, isn't it?
Guest list, but I don't want to kind of get in the way of the many questions hurling towards us for too long, but I'll give you a brief update if I may. The virtual gala is this Saturday. I don't know what's better, that it's free to register, or that it features such stars as, I'm going to run down the list very quickly, F. Murray Abraham, Angela Bassett, Judi Dench, Ray Fiennes, Norm Lewis, Helen Mirren, Liev Schreiber, and Courtney B. Vance. The list is so long, we can't even name everyone on this broadcast. And 2,000 people have already registered. So please join those people. Don't miss out. Go to our website on Saturday and learn more. The show's on Saturday and it starts at 7 p.m. I am going to be live at the Sydney Harmon Hall. Wish me luck and look forward to sharing the night with you all. Back to you, Drew.
Simon is going to be in his DJ, his dinner jacket, which is a bit of lingo that I learned before we started the show tonight. Question from Jack and Nancy Gardner, which I think maybe, Michael, it might be interesting to get your opinion on this. Can you compare Richard II by Shakespeare with Edward II by Christopher Marlowe? This might be a little bit of a gotcha question, but these two plays appear very similar, roughly around the same time, and there's this rivalry between young Shakespeare and the more established Marlowe.
Maybe a little bit of a gotcha, but they're both plays about faction. They're both plays about kings who make mistakes, and both kings are dispatched. So I think Shakespeare was influenced pretty clearly by that play. And we now know that Marlowe had a hand in some of the Henry VIs from stylometrics. So these two guys thought with each other as theater artists. But I mean, I'll say I prefer Richard II as a play for some of the reasons that Nora described. I think this is a play where it's possible to be a flawed king and also a sympathetic bad king. And so it has that depth that speaks to so many.
Yes, and perhaps Marlowe's Edward is not as sympathetic or as complicated as Richard is. I think it's maybe fair to say. I personally think of Richard II as one of those plays where Shakespeare takes a huge leap in his poetry, in his characterization, in his dramaturgy. It is a quantum leap along with these other plays he was writing at the time. I would like to hear some passages first before we get to more questions. Naomi, you already read wonderfully. I wonder, Nora, have you prepared a passage for us tonight? And if so, what scene, what character?
Yes, so I actually prepared the same thing that Naomi spoke of earlier. And in terms of thinking of the transition of power, I think a lot of people think about Bolingbroke and Richard. I was very much interested in Gaunt, because we have that in that first scene between Gaunt and the Duchess, where the Duchess is really urging him to speak to Richard, and he's telling her that this is a direct. He is anointed by God, right? And it's up to God to solve this matter. And then the next scene that we see Gaunt in, he declares himself a prophet. And I just really love that, because we have the very previous scene where he's saying that Richard is the person who directly speaks from God. And then he calls himself a prophet, which no matter what, in many religions, that is someone who has the word directly from God. So I really appreciate that moment of Gaunt snatching the power in saying, I'm a prophet and this is the curse that I speak. And so I'm just going to read a few lines from that. Methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him. His rash, fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. He tires betime that spurs too fast betimes. With eager feeding, food doth choke the feeder, light vanity, insatiate cormorant. Consuming means soon preys upon itself. And then he goes on and on, speaking about the land of England. And he ends it with saying, "Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life? How happy then were my ensuing death." It's a very long monologue, but I just really love these lines. I really love how, like I said, Gaunt really positions himself as someone who has these words directly from God. It is no longer Richard who is the only person who can communicate with a higher power. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
I just wanted to come in quickly on Nora to say that I agree with you. The speech is extraordinary and it's very much kind of held up on England as a kind of an incredible account, you know, of the country and what it means and what it could mean and what it has come to mean. But a line that came from that same speech as well for me, just speaking to some of Naomi's very charged political prophecy, and that Naomi was just sharing with us, but is that the discussion last night in the media about, on both sides, about the piece of theatre that I'm sure we all watched, which is the presidential debate. And people saying it was the worst, you know, debate ever, or there's the kind of extremity of response on both sides. It made me think of that line in the same speech that you quoted. This dear, dear land is now, and I paraphrase, I just cut a little bit to put these two lines together. This dear, dear land is now bound in with shame. And it was like, and I remember directing that moment on the stage and it just resounding. And as you were saying, Naomi, as well, the fact that it's a very old man on his deathbed achieving prophet-like status is a very powerful theatrical image. So thank you, Nora. Drew.
And I believe, Simon, am I right that Winston Churchill read that speech during the Blitz over the radio to people in London saying, this Isle, this England, it has this kind of power through the ages.
Yeah.
Michael, I wonder what passage you've chosen.
It's so tough to listen to actors and speak these lines and then to just try and fumble through them. But I do have a passage I wanted to read. This is from the deposition scene, which actually was left out of the early printings of this play because it was just so shocking to actually depict someone trying to give away power. But this is Richard, and we may have a link in the comments to the speech, but Richard's saying, I know, no I, for I must nothing be, therefore no, for I resign to thee. That means I'm going to give you the crown. Now mark how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head and this unwieldy scepter from my hand, the pride of kingly sway from out my heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm, and with mine own hands I give away my crown. This is a literally impossible, well, say it is a metaphysically impossible thing for someone to do, at least in terms of medieval political theory. So I think for a lot of people seeing this, it was just unthinkable.
And, you know, it's interesting, the word nothing in that speech, Michael, because I was reading the play this afternoon and I was reading the speech in Act 5, Scene 5 in the Tower, and the last lines of that speech by Richard, whate'er I be, nor I nor any man but man is, with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing. That this word kind of echoes through the play, and the word nothing attains all this meaning. We actually had a question about the 1601 performance from our viewer, Robin. Shakespeare was politically astute. Why take the risk of performing this play in 1601? Why let Essex and his men pay extra to the Lord Chamberlain's men to stage this play a day before they try to assassinate Elizabeth I? And the scene was so controversial that it could not be published in the quarto. What was Shakespeare thinking?
It may not have been his decision, but it was also a lot of money. So they really had to pay for this performance. But it's true that some of the people who heard that performance were actually then tried and killed for the insurrection. So I would actually call this a bit of bad political judgment if it was Shakespeare's choice. He tended to stay out of trouble. We don't know if Elizabeth actually said, "I am Richard II, know ye not that." She might have said it, but it's really a spectacular allegory for what Essex was trying to convince the people of, which the Queen has bad counsel, the people are on my side, she's arbitrary. It's an argument. And the idea that the Globe players would actually play it, even for a substantial fee, is surprising to me.
And it doesn't seem like an accident that Shakespeare, around 1601, stops writing history plays and starts writing plays set in Denmark and ancient Rome and Poland, and nothing to do with the king or the queen. It's like very far away from anything to do with. He seems like he learned his lesson very clearly, if he did indeed show some bad judgment. Naomi, you've already read brilliantly at the top of our show. Did you also have another passage? It's totally fine if you don't.
Oh, well, I do. But I wanted to comment a little bit on the idea of God and being ordained in this country. And I came across a Barbara Bush quote about Bush the First. "You may think the president is all powerful, but he is not. He needs a lot of guidance from the Lord." Which implies that he's in touch with God and getting personal guidance to lead the country. So we are not, even though we're supposed to separate church and state, we are so not. It's in our Pledge of Allegiance. It's in our oath and office. Anyway, but I thought I would bring a little bit of lightness, the only comedic scene in this play, the Duchess of York. It seemed to me there's a question about loyalty in the play of what are you loyal to? And the Duchess of York is loyal to her child. She doesn't give a fig for the rule of law, for country, for leaders, for justice, for God or the throne. She's going to save her own. And she doesn't play by the rules. And I thought it was interesting, if I were doing this now, I might take a cue from what's happening in our country today, because she's pushy, insistent, passionate. She won't be ignored. She makes emotional, not a rational argument. Her whole argument when she goes to sue for Bolingbroke is, he's not, look at my husband. He's not crying. He's rational, not passionate. He's not as loud as I am. We'll outlast him in kneeling, and therefore we're more deserving. She says, pleads he in earnest? Look upon his face. His eyes do drop no tears. His prayers are in jest. His words come from his mouth, ours from our breast. He prays but faintly and would be denied. We pray with heart and soul and all beside. His weary joints would gladly rise. I know our knees shall kneel till to the ground they grow. Our prayers do outpray his. Then let them have that mercy which true prayer ought to have. And I just think that's, I love that her entire argument, and it's one of the reasons the scene is comedic, is that there's no there. She's basically just saying, I'm going to be pushy until you do what I need you to do, and I'm going to outlast him. And the only other thing I wanted to mention about the change that Richard goes through, which we won't have time to get to this, but it seems to me I wanted to ask this question of Simon and Michael, and Simon who's directed the play, is it seems to me that people don't change. You don't give up that power until there is such a deep humiliation. And that's what you just said, Michael, about until you realize you're nothing. In other words, until you can source from within, and whatever the humiliation is from the outside, you've got to adjust to that, or find a way to deal with that, or find a way to, some people, some people have fantasies of revenge, or they get angry, and then other people, if it goes internal, I imagine it's, there's depression or suicide. And people that are humiliated, I know in prisons are put on suicide watch. And so I'm just sort of fascinated with the idea of what really causes that change. What does he have to come to? Our sympathies are with him, and yet there seems to be that he has to reach a certain point of humiliation before he's willing to give that up. That's all. I was curious about that.
Well, I mean, I just want to leave on that, Naomi, and say absolutely. I think it's a big thing going right back to the Greeks, isn't it? That suffering imparts wisdom. And I'm just thinking about Nora's point about fear and what happens to us to somehow free ourselves from fear, if fear is what is leading us to crave power. It's such a very, very rich question. I was thinking as I was reading the play again today, and I found these lines, which I think really speak to a lot of what we're speaking about knowledge, change, sympathy. So when Richard feels like his days are numbered as a king, he says to his colleagues, throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty. For you have mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you. Feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? And it's very hard not to feel very moved in the theatre when you hear a great actor or actress say that. And it also reminds me, talking of the metaphysics of the play, about the Christ analogy, that there seems to be a relationship, veiled, complicated, uncertain, occasional, between this figure going on a wheel of fortune journey and becoming more sensitized and more tender as the suffering heightens. And we know that in the Bible, that I find the most moving scene in the New Testament being in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Christ is reaching out to the friends to stay up with him for that one night. And of course, the disciples all fall asleep, and he's terribly disappointed that they can't do that one thing for him. But I don't know what it is in our souls that responds to that kind of language, what Shakespeare's doing to us, but there's certainly a change.
And Simon, this may be a kind of out there comparison or linkage, but there have been queer readings of both this play and also Marlowe's Edward II, of Richard and Edward as possibly homosexual or homosocial figures. We haven't talked about Bushy and Green and all of Richard's male followers in the court, Richard's sort of extravagant, self-theatricalizing, self-dramatizing behaviors. Is he being pushed out in this homophobic way by this very heteronormative society?
Yeah. And I think Nora could come into that, because I found, Nora, when I was directing it, the Queen has a very sensitized relationship to Richard, but it's not in conventional terms romantic, is it? I mean, we don't see them being intimate, let's say. I don't know how you navigated that, Nora.
Right. Yeah, I saw the relationship as a political one, not a romantic one. And I know that back then there was always this age gap in these sort of relationships. But I think that if there was queerness, then that would offer Isabel some form of protection, in that her being so young, she may not have to, be as committed to certain wifely duties. And it could be more of a friendship, more of an alliance. And that's how I viewed it. And that's how I made sense of it. And so the heartbreak for me as the character was more so as this was someone who I viewed as a lifelong partner. And it doesn't have to be romantic in that way. But I think our production was also very interested in that queer aspect of Richard II.
A comment from viewer Jared, picking up on the word nothing. Of course, he invokes King Lear, which we discussed a few weeks ago, the line, nothing comes from nothing, which of course, as Michael, you pointed out, is a scene where the king is trying to hand over power to Cordelia. And she says that she wants no power. She wants nothing from him. Two more questions. One from viewer Terry. Does Shakespeare see a transcendent good to which power accounts? Or does he follow Hobbes, even though Hobbes writes Leviathan after Shakespeare's life, order as good in and of itself? So is there a moral good in the universe, or is just power power? And a question from viewer Kirk: this is such a great play. Why is it not performed more often? So I'm not sure in what order we want to address those.
I can do a quick list of why it performs more often, and then I'm going to hand over to others to speak about the excellent Hobbes question. As a director, I think one challenge with the play, I agree it's beautiful, but the one thing about Richard II is there's no fighting in it. Even that joust at the beginning never happens because Richard stops it before they even get going. So it's a very wordy play. And either you love it for that, or you think, ooh, bit too many words. So it's not a romp like Midsummer Night's Dream. It's not got fighting in it like Romeo and Juliet, the two other plays that he was writing that year. It's a very concentrated, I don't know, art house versus exquisite glass jar. And that's
I was saying to Grace Ann before we started the show, it is a play completely lacking in reversal in an Aristotelian sense. That the action goes in one direction and it is unchanged in that direction. There is a crisscrossing of Bolingbroke and Richard. And Simon's got to look like, I'm not sure I agree with Drew's analysis.
Well, but let's hear some thoughts on order before I order and Hobbesian theory. That's, I think, my call, yeah.
So Hobbes publishes the Leviathan after the English Civil War, and the frontispiece of that book, if you can Google it, but it's actually of a monarch whose body is actually filled in with lots of little people. It's a very odd illustration. And what Hobbes was trying to say was there really can be no monarchical power unless it is given to the monarch by people. And when the monarch acts, the state is acting on behalf of the people. That they have to give the power over because this is a nasty world. And as he said, man is a wolf to other men, meaning we prey on each other. And the only thing that will keep us protected is if we give our power to someone who has the right to punish and protect. So that's a very bleak view of the world. That is certainly the view of King Lear. I think there's no higher power in that play, and that's why it's such a challenging play. But I think in that play, the tenderness that Lear shows to Cordelia and his newfound sensitivity to the real plight of humanity, and that this is what Simon was saying, that, you know, a monarch needs bread and friends. I think that human vulnerability was in a way the highest possible good for Shakespeare, that he really believed that even in a world of power politics, there's something almost transcendent about our ability to grow and sympathize. And I have to say, I'll place all my bets on that. I think it's worth betting the house on that idea. And I think the theater depends on it.
Wow. Well, and in fact, Terry is chiming in. He's quite aware, thank you, Drew, that Hobbes is post-Shakespeare, but you could say he distilled the theory of divine right philosophically. Although what it makes me think is Nora and Naomi both read these passages by John of Gaunt speaking about the thousands within the one. And it seems maybe Hobbes comes out of Shakespeare, albeit in this very pessimistic, dark way. Well, we have reached an hour on the Shakespeare Hour Live. I want to thank you all for joining us for, I think, this very enriching, very profound, very moving, very interesting conversation. Our gala this Saturday, don't forget, features the riveting stories of some truly groundbreaking Black Shakespearean actors and theater makers. And next week on the Shakespeare Hour Live, we will continue to tell these stories with a special episode on Shakespeare, Black actors, and whiteness. I will be joined by a guest co-host, my STC colleague, Leonie Noble, and we will also be joined by Dr. Sawika Colbert of Georgetown University and an STC associate artist, and other guests to be announced soon. So for me, it's good night. Simon?
Yes, thank you. I'm so thrilled that Sawika is joining us next week. Sawika is a new associate director, in fact. So that's absolutely thrilling to have her on our team. And I'm excited that she's going to be on the show next week. Now, I'm actually going to be on the other side of the camera next Wednesday because I'm tuning in as a viewer, because I am going to be traveling on a secret Shakespeare project, which I'm going to let you all know more about very soon. I will be back for the following week's episode on October the 14th. So Thank you all for an amazing episode. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Naomi, for joining us. It's been an absolute thrill to be in dialogue with you all this evening. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in for another fantastic Shakespeare Hour Live. Good night.